Now, from Archaeology News Northeast, the latest archaeology news and interviews from around the UK. This is Tales from the Trowel.
So I called the story The Devil's Boy. And it begins. Brass House Farm, near Ferry Hill, is the site of a most terrible tale. On a cold January night in 1683, the devil spoke to Andrew Mills and told him to kill. He obeyed and murdered 3 children in their beds with an axe. Jane Brass laughed. "They'll be fine," she said soothingly. "I'll keep an eye on them both." John and Margaret looked at each other. Then they both smiled. "You're a good girl, Jane," John said and gave her a hug. "These Christmas parties are never-ending," Margaret said, shaking her head. "We're up to our eyes until Candlemas." "Go," Jane laughed again. "Have fun." Her parents went off to get ready. Jane went to check on her brother, John, and sister Elizabeth. They were playing together near the fire. It was already dark out, and the servant boy Andrew was feeding the oxen and putting the chickens into their coops. He was a strange boy who followed her around a lot, but he was harmless enough. She watched him from the window of the farmhouse. "Right, we're off," said her father as he walked down the stairs. "It won't be a late one." "Give me a hug," called Margaret. John and Elizabeth raced to their mother and hugged her. Then they were back by the fire playing their games once more. "See," said Jane, "they're fine, now go." Jane then kneeled by the fire and joined in with their games. After locking their children safely in the house, John and Margaret waved to Andrew the servant boy. "Go home, Andrew," John called. "It's late." The pair then turned up their collars and headed down the lane toward Ferry Hill. Andrew watched them go. He nodded. It was late, and he was tired. He slowly walked to the cowshed and slid the bolt across to lock the cows in for the night. It was at this moment that 2 voices spoke simultaneously inside his head. "Kill all." Andrew turned to see who had spoken the dreadful words. "Kill all." It was a command. It came from inside his own head. "Kill all." Andrew's eyes slid over to the farmhouse. He could see the orange glow of the fire. He could just about make out the laughter from within. The boy then walked over to the tool shed. He scanned the contents. His gaze finally rested upon a large felling axe. An empty smile grew upon his face. He took the axe and made his way toward the house. Andrew tried the handle of the front door. It was locked. He banged at the door with the axe. "What do you want, Andrew?" Jane called through the wood. He didn't reply. He knocked again. "It's locked and my parents have the key," she shouted. "What do you want?" She peered through the window. Beside the door at him, he held up the axe and shouted back, "Kill all!" Jane screamed. She turned and ran into the living room. She grabbed her siblings and raced up the stairs. They flew into Elizabeth's bedroom and bolted the door. Andrew began to swing the axe. The huge blade hungrily tore through the wood of the door. With every swing and slam, the Brass children cried out in terror. Dragging the axe across the floor noisily, Andrew slowly and deliberately stomped up the stairs. The axe smashed into the bedroom door, and in 2 more heavy hits, it flew from its hinges. Jane rushed forward with her hands outstretched. "Please, Andrew," she sobbed. "No!" He pushed the girl onto the floor. John jumped up and lunged his fists at Andrew, but the axe-wielding servant boy hit him on the head. John slumped to the floor. Then Andrew cut his throat with the blade. Jane screamed as she watched the blood flow. The axe came thudding down and she was silent. Elizabeth was hiding under the sheets, sobbing loudly. Andrew pulled them off her. He stared down at the crying girl. "Please, Andrew, don't," she begged. "Remember all those times we played with my dolls." The boy stopped. His eyes darted between the axe and the girl. "Remember when we chased the ducks?" Andrew turned and walked out of the room. He stood and looked down the corridor. That is when he saw it. The devil appeared to Andrew in the form of a hideous creature. It had the head of a wolf, legs of a stag, and body of an eagle. The monstrous wings flapped 3 times, then circled the boy. Fiery red eyes glowed as it stared at him. "Go back, thou hateful wretch. Resume thy cursed knife. I long to view more blood. Spare not the young one's life." Andrew turned away from the apparition and walked slowly back into the bedroom. With a heavy thud, Elizabeth was the third victim that night. Andrew ran down the stairs, leaving the axe in the bedroom. He was covered in blood from head to toe. He ran from the farmhouse and into Ferry Hill. There he heard the bustling party from a grand mansion. He hammered at the door. When it was answered, Andrew pushed his way into the party. The stunned onlookers fell silent. "2 men broke into your house," he blurted out, pointing at the brass parents. "They killed your children and shouted, 'Kill all,' as they did it. I heard them." There was silence once again. Then Margaret stepped forward and pointed at Andrew. "Villain!" she spat. "None other but you have killed my children." The guests then fell upon Andrew and dragged him to some troopers that were staying at Ferry Hill. They had been on their way from Darlington to Durham and happened to be spending the night there. Andrew was arrested and convicted of his crimes. He was returned to Ferry Hill for the execution. His arms and legs were tied with chains, and he was bound in an iron cage. The cage was set out overlooking the farmhouse where the murders had occurred. That way, Andrew's last sight would be the horrific scene of the crime. He did not die quickly. His howls of pain and torment were heard in Ferry Hill and beyond. Ravens devoured his eyes first, then his flesh. Eventually, when the screams of torment were no more, he was dead. The body was left in the cage to decompose. Then he was cut down and burnt. His ashes were blown away over the farmland. The Brass children were buried in a churchyard in Kirk Merrington. On the tomb, these words are carved: "Reader, remember sleeping. We were slain, and here we sleep till we must rise again. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Thou shalt do no murder." Indeed, Andrew Mills, the axe murderer from Ferry Hill, can still be heard howling in rage on cold January nights. His ghost is said to be waiting to take his revenge on the people of Durham who killed him.
And that's a story and a half.
It's awful, isn't it?
It's an awful story.
It's awful, and here we are, right at that very site.
Yeah, at the grave of Elizabeth, John and Jane.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It feels a bit eerie being here, and with those words carved into the gravestone where we're standing.
Yeah.
Very, very creepy. And, you know, the thought of that ghost being sort of here. It's good that it's October and not January, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't think I could have done it in January.
No, it feels a little bit strange, really.
Yeah, it really does.
But I suppose that's the sort of fascination of the paranormal is the link to the real people.
Yeah.
And the true history that's involved. So, anyway, awful story.
So, I'm going to jump to one of the questions that I've got for you, Eddie,
Yeah.
which actually was going to be further down the list, but
Okay.
feels right to sort of come up with this one. Is that why do you think it's important to preserve these stories? You know, this is folk tales, but actually this goes beyond a folk tale because this was true, and we know this was true.
I mean, this is a strange folktale because I have included it in my book of County Durham folktales, but it almost didn't make it in the book. The publishers, the History Press, and we had quite a long discussion because we sort of discussed, is this a folktale or is it not? And we were going to follow the collection up with the book of County Durham ghost stories. And there's quite a few ghost stories in this book, and we were going to shift them to one side, and this was going to be one of those stories that were going to be put into the ghost stories collection, which never actually happened. And that was why we decided to keep it. And we decided to keep it as a folk story because folk story, by its very definition of its name, is a story of the people. The folk are the people of the region, and this is a story of those people. But it also includes the history of those people, and this story personifies that in the sense that it includes the values, the fears, and the morals of a community. And in that sense, it's like a cautionary tale.
Okay.
If you do things to people, then this is what is going to happen to you. You're going to be murdered in this horrific way.
Yeah.
And your soul isn't going to go to heaven. You're going to be cursed to haunt this land forevermore.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that there's this warning on this gravestone, it's a warning to people not to commit these deeds.
Yeah. It's powerful words. I presume these must have been written by the parents that they've put this message on here.
And at the time, this 17th century community would have been a deeply religious community.
Of course.
And thou shalt not murder being, part of the Ten Commandments, very much a commandment that would have been revisited, particularly when events like these happened. And the community would have been rocked by this murder. It would have been shocked by it.
Yeah.
And a lot of what I included in the folktale were from, yes, it's relatively fictional, but it's also based upon fact. We know that these murders happened, but also the testimony from the court case were included as well. The description of the apparition of the devil were taken from what Andrew Mills said in the court case, and also the troopers arresting him and him being accused on sight, him being covered in blood, etc., him saying the words that the devil said to him, not describing it as an axe, but describing it as a knife that he used, even though it was an axe because the axe was left at the murder scene. All of these things are details that I wanted to include, but it would have shocked, the local community, and, it would have resonated deeply with the people. They would have been shocked, and this is a lasting reminder, this gravestone, of the impact that it would have had at that time, and probably still does have.
And it's so detached from this place that we're at, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, this village where we're at, Kirk Merrington, is a it's very typical chocolate box village, isn't it?
Really
It's a very
is,
pretty little quiet village.
Yeah.
We're up here at the church on the top of the hill here, and you've got lovely views all the way around. It's just a beautiful place, and to think just a mile or so down the road from here, this awful thing happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is unreal.
It's unimaginable, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the Kirk Merrington remains a real community village. I mean, I as part of my job, I visit local primary schools and teach creative writing. And I've been into Kirk Merrington Primary School, and it's one of the most beautiful primary schools I've ever been to. Yeah. It's a quite unique school. The school secretary organised for a train to be delivered to the school. It's completely mad. She organised for a train track so she organised the funding for it, right, and the local community got behind it. So a train track was laid at the primary school. A train was sourced and a train was delivered to the primary school. Funding was sourced to turn this train into a reading train, and it's now been turned into the school library so the children can climb on board the train, sit on board the train, and reading is celebrated. And it was all money that was raised by local businesses and by the local community. And that's what this community is. They get behind projects like that, and they get behind supporting their local children. And I suspect it's been like that since the village was first built.
Yeah.
So dating back to this horrible story, when you've got such a community-minded village like this, a shocking incident like that would have sent shockwaves through the whole place, and probably still does today.
Oh, yeah, I would imagine so. So that brings me on to my next question, which is about research.
Yes.
So how do you go out researching stories for your books? I mean, this obviously, is a shocker.
Yeah.
And you said that it maybe almost didn't make it into the book.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this folktale stands out from the rest of the book. There are the other ghost stories that are in there. There's one from Tudor called Nicky Nacky Field, which involves a horrible murder, but it's also quite humorous. It's about where there's a field nearby, near to this farm, where you've got these reapers who've just finished the harvest, working for the farmer. And at the end of the reaping, they all go to the farmer's house and they're all getting drunk. And at the end of it, they all finish their beer and they say to the farmer, "Have you not got any more ale?" And the farmer says, "I'll pay for the ale if you go and get some." So there's one of the reapers who's busy at the toilet. And when he comes back, all the other reapers say to him, "The farmer said that you need to go to the brewery to go and get some more ale." And he said, "Well, I can't because I'll have to go through Nicky Nacky Field. And it's haunted. I'm not going through there." And they said, "Well, you have to. The farmer said that you need to go there." And he says, "Well, I've told you it's haunted. I don't want to." Anyway, they make it. And off he goes. And all the other reapers say, "Isn't it hilarious? He thinks it's haunted. Let's get a chip on it. Let's take a bedsheet, hide in the field, and we'll jump out and pretend that one of us is a ghost." So one of them takes the sheet, goes off into the field and waits for this poor unfortunate reaper. Anyway, the reaper comes home, or comes back to the farm rather, and the other reapers are all giggling and they're all saying, so did you see a ghost? And he says, well, I did, but actually I saw 2 ghosts. And they're all laughing their heads off, saying, well, what happened? And he said, well, I came back from the brewery and the brewery was shut, so I didn't get any beer. And they're all booing and things. And they said, so what happened with the ghost? And he said, well, this ghost popped up with a white sheet and it started saying, ooh. And he said, and I was ever so frightened when another ghost appeared behind it and it was covered in rags and it had huge, great big claws. And I was ever so frightened that I shouted, black ghost, can you stop the white ghost from getting me? And the black ghost leapt up into the air and tore the white ghost to shreds. And that was when I managed to escape and come back here. And there was silence in the room as they realised that their friend had been torn to shreds by the real ghost of Nicky Nacky Field. And even though it's a horrible story, it provokes a bit of a laugh. Yeah. And it's the sort of story that you'd tell down the pub. Whereas the story of Andrew Mills, it's not really a pub story.
No.
And it feels very different to the other folk tales. And it's not a story, I mentioned that I work in schools. I'll share lots of the folk tales of County Durham in schools, but this isn't a story that I tend to share. Not even at Halloween. I'll share some more sort of humorous ghost stories or stories where they've got a bit of a twist in the tale or something like that. Whereas this just kind of, it's important that we keep these folk tales alive so that we, don't forget these stories. People are interested in cultural heritage. We want to keep the region's history alive by retelling the history of the region. But at the same time, this isn't really a story that I want to tell for entertainment purposes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's more sort of to keep that cultural heritage alive more than anything.
Yeah.
As opposed to for entertainment purposes. I mean, we as a nation, we're very interested in the paranormal. There's a podcast that I listen to called Uncanny, which is all about sort of people having uncanny and paranormal experiences, and it's a fascinating listen. Some of them, it's difficult to disprove what people are talking about, and I think a lot of us are interested in that. But this feels very different.
Yeah,
and particularly with that kind of like appearance of the devil to Andrew Mills in 17th century County Durham, there would have been an awful lot of suspicion of possession from the devil, of people doing things that they didn't mean to do as if they had been possessed. Yeah. And exorcism from the church would have been rife at that time as well. And also distrust of witchcraft and things like that.
Absolutely, yeah. You've got people like Matthew Hopkins going around the witch finder.
That's right, with the Malleus Malefictor.
Yes.
Have you heard of that book?
Yes, I've read some of it.
Yeah.
It's a meaty read.
It is a meaty read. And that is the perfect example of fake news. We talk about fake news now. Yeah. It was written by this German guy who was a complete lunatic, who just basically decided, I'm going to write this book. This is how you spot a witch. Yes. And this is my opinion of how you spot a witch. And it was created at the time that the Caxton Press was very first invented. So for the very first time, this ramblings of a madman was then mass produced and people believed it. Yeah. And it was sent off and it unfortunately caused the death of thousands of innocent women. Yeah.
And men.
And men as well. Yeah. As witches too. As like, well, this is the truth. Then this is why we're going to kill you because you fit into this text. Yeah. And so, whereas Andrew Mills, in this case, very much seems like an incredibly guilty party.
I think it's quite incredible how the amount of people who were tried as witches went up when suddenly there was a bounty. For the amount that you got. You were paid a shilling or something for every witch that you found in a village. Yeah. You need to raise a bit of money. And it's like, so I think I'm probably going to need to find 4 today.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just to cover the rent.
Yeah, exactly.
And Monty Python parodies that incredibly well. It's just in I think is it in the Holy Grail? Yeah, they was just like, well, she's got a walk. She must be a witch. It's that sort of thing. Yeah. And it's awful. But with, we're standing right here at the gravestone of Jane, John and Elizabeth, who very much are the victims. It makes you wonder sort of how much of a victim perhaps Andrew was as well, because in the current climate of people with profound mental health issues, it does make you wonder how much of a victim Andrew was with mental health.
Yeah. He's described as a half-wit. Now,
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What exactly?
What does that mean?
Yeah,
yes,
it's
yeah.
a very nondescript.
Yes,
somebody who maybe doesn't have any schooling. Who knows what exactly they meant by that?
And I'm not excusing by any stretch any murder under any circumstances whatsoever, but it does bring to light perhaps the sort of servant-master relationship and how fraught that might have been at that time. This might have been. Some people think that this might have been like an exaggerated tension of that when I was doing the research. I haven't really answered your question, have I? So regarding this sort of research, I tried to find as many historical documents to make the retelling as accurate as I could. But I'm also very, very fortunate that I've got friends who have lived in this area their whole entire lives and are far more knowledgeable than I am. So I've got a friend who's a historian, he's a reenactor, he's a medieval musician and an all-round expert of County Durham. His name's Paul Martin, and he's my absolute go-to.
Right.
And there's also a friend of mine who works at Newcastle Castle, and he's a storyteller called Dave Silk. We wrote a book together called Time and Way of Folktales for Children.
Right.
And what he doesn't know about folklore isn't worth knowing.
Yeah.
And so Dave Silk and Paul Martin I go to a lot.
Is he the guy who's trying to campaign for a monument to the witches of Newcastle?
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. That's him.
I was reading about him.
Yeah. Really smart guy. And Paul Martin is the person, I don't know if you've heard of something called Plough Sunday, where it was a tradition in County Durham years ago, where the plough is dragged from the fields all the way into the city centre in Durham. And it's taken to the market square where the Morris dancers dance around it. Right. And then it's dragged up to the cathedral. And there it's blessed by the dean of the cathedral. And then it's taken on a pub crawl around Durham by all the farmers and Morris dancers and whoever wants to join him.
Yeah.
And Paul started doing that about 10 years ago with a group of about 3 or 4 of us. Right. And last count, it needed a police presence. And the dean of the cathedral has an order of service for it now.
Right.
And it's just fantastic.
Yes.
It's just grown and grown. And Paul tries to bring back these ancient traditions of Durham. And so it's people that I talk to that are far more knowledgeable than me about these folk tales, and it's just doing the extensive research, particularly with a story like this, where you want to show respect and get the story right for the people who were involved.
Absolutely, because obviously these were real people. This was a real family that was devastated, and also Andrew Mill's family. I mean, because we don't know anything about his family, do we?
Absolutely.
His background, where he came from, just that he worked at the farm.
Yeah, and that's all we know about it. And there are documentations to say that he got on very well with the children, that he did play with them. That little detail I put in the story about him chasing the ducks and playing with the dolls, that there were records that he did do that with the children, that he often played with them. Yeah. And so that this thing that happened completely out of the blue, this utter demonic possession or complete breakdown of the psyche, of the mind, but then blaming these fictitious burglars, then that gives it another dimension of it gives it a more devious nature, doesn't it? Because that does suggest a sound mind. Yeah,
I was going to say that makes you think halfway, how much of that was play acting.
Yeah, exactly. It's it's a very complicated and complex tale, isn't it?
Yeah. I think there's more to it than we'll ever know.
Absolutely. But the story would be forgotten forever if it wasn't retold either orally or through books. And and this gravestone with its memorial, but also with its cautionary warning on there, is what keeps it alive. Yeah. And it's these folk tales that by telling them in schools, by telling them through story, that's how we keep the oral tradition and traditions of the local area.
These
in people's minds.
Warnings written into these stories.
Exactly. Yeah.
Don't go walking through fields on your own at night.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the purpose of the traditional tales like Little Red Riding Hood, like stories like Cinderella, etc. They were all cautionary tales. They were warning children not to talk to strangers, not to walk through the woods. The Brothers Grimm, the dark stories that they were all stories with a warning attached to them. There's a character in County Durham folk tales of Peg Powler. I don't know if you've heard of. She's from the River Tees, and she's a river witch. And it's said that she lives in the river and she eats children. And I didn't have specific victims' names like I do with this story here. from the Brass family. So I had to make up some victims. So I chose several of my friends to be killed in the story.
Okay.
and Peg Powler eats children. And when the river tees, you get that like white foam on the surface of the water.
Yes, yes.
That's Peg Powler frothing at the mouth because she becomes hungry.
Right.
And she's a bit like Jenny Greenskin, I think she's called, further south. You get different versions of her across the country.
Okay.
And the purpose of Peg Powler was basically to warn children not to go near the river.
Yeah.
And we still have students and other unfortunate people who drown in the river every year, not just at the Tees, but on the Tyne as well. And these stories, they acted as warnings to people to save lives, basically. So, there's always an origin in a story. The theory being that there are only 7 stories in the world, which is why 7 Stories in Newcastle is called 7 Stories.
Right.
Not just because it's 7 stories high, but the theory being that there are only 7 stories and everything's just a variation of those 7 stories. Which is why you get versions of, like, Beauty and the Beast, for example. There's an ancient Greek version of that that's over 4,000 years old. And, the stories kind of date back even further than that. So, yeah.
It's really interesting.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, going back to the Brothers Grimm.
Yes.
I mean, you're saying that we tell children these bedtime stories.
Yeah.
And if you start to unpick some of the stories, they are not really suitable for bedtime or for children.
Absolutely. No, definitely not. I mean, the original version of Goldilocks, she was an old woman called Silverhair, and she was a burglar who used to break into people's houses. And on this one particular occasion, she broke into the house of 3 fishermen brothers. And on this one day, she broke into this house and she sat in their chairs and she ate the porridge and slept in their beds. And when the fishermen brothers came home and found her, they threw her out of the window and they killed her.
Right.
And that was like the original version, or the oldest version that we've discovered of Goldilocks. But, the stories, they contain great power. They kind of teach. They're meant to teach children the sort of difference between doing good and that they're meant to have like a strong moral code. But it's interesting that, perhaps slightly off topic here, but when the Nazis first rose to power in Germany, one of the first things they did was they reprinted something called the German House Book, and they changed the Brothers Grimm folk tales to make to make all the villains Jewish, and they twisted those tales because they understood the power of those stories, and they wanted to implant in young people's minds that Jewish people were evil. And the first thing that they knew that these stories would do that. They wanted to manipulate young children's minds. Yeah. And one of the other things they did was they put 2 movies in movie theaters for free and invited families to go and see them at no cost. And it was Little Red Riding Hood and Puss in Boots. And in Little Red Riding Hood, they replaced the woodcutter character with an SS officer, so that he was the hero of the story. Right. And in Puss in Boots, they had Puss wearing a swastika armband. And at the end, everybody stood around with their arm raised, shouting, hail Puss, to make it synonymous with children's minds that you only hailed a hero. They absolutely manipulated the fairy tale because they understood the power of them. Right. It's fascinating.
Yeah,
isn't it?
Since I didn't know anything about that.
It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, using things for your
power
own.
Of the story, and that's how powerful these stories are. Yeah. And the Brothers Grimm, the edition that I've got, they're not called Brothers Grimm fairy tales; they're called Brothers Grimm folk tales, because that's what they are. They're the folk. They're the tales of the people, the tales of the folk. Yeah, because that's how we teach about people. Yeah. And I suppose that's why I'm so interested in them, because they do teach about people. They teach us about psychology, and they teach us empathy. They teach us how to relate to each other as human beings, and that's why I'm so fascinated by them.
Yeah, amazing. Well, Adam Bushnell, thank you so much for meeting me
welcome,
in a graveyard.
At least it's sunny. It's a cheerful graveyard.
It is a cheerful graveyard. But yeah, thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Cheers.